This is Robin Stripling with the Special Education Unit at the Department of Education, and I wanted to share some information with you today about statewide assessment and assessment accommodations. These are the assessments that will be given in Arkansas this year. You'll notice that in grades 1 and 2, the Iowa will be again given. There is no alternate assessment for the Iowa for students with significant cognitive disabilities. The ACT Aspire will be given in grades 3 through 10, and the alternate for ACT Aspire is the Science Portfolio in 5, 7, and 10, as well as the MSAA for math and literacy. The 11th graders will take the ACT. That is the same year that students who take alternate assessments will be taking the MSAA. For grades K through 12, for students who are English learners, they will again take the ELPA 21. There is no alternate for the ELPA 21 for students who are English learners and also have significant cognitive disability. So the ACT will be given on the dates shown here. You will notice that districts may choose to have a paper version or online version of the ACT this year. Also, students who take the alternate assessment will not be required to take the ACT. These are some dates that you may want to share with teachers in your district. The Science Portfolio is due on March 17th. However, the early submission date is February 28th, so those can be submitted before March 17th. You will notice the dates there for MSAA, April 3rd through May 12th. The training modules for MSAA will be available in mid-March, and again, those will be required for test administrators to give the MSAA. Here are a few changes from last year regarding statewide assessment. This year, once a student has submitted a test, that student may read or do homework as long as the homework is not from the subject that was being tested. Students will need to bring information with them, the book that they're going to read, the work that they're going to work on. Students should not talk to other students after they finish their section of the test, and they may not use their computer to access the internet once a test has been submitted. Second bullet is about test sessions and the timing. Test sessions may not end early. If all students have submitted their test, they still need to stay on that scheduled end time. However, for students who have extra time, they do not have to sit for the entire additional time. They may not move ahead if they finish before the regular time, but they do not have to sit all of the extra time. They only need to sit in that test environment until all of the students in that group have finished. Students repeating any grade 3 through 10 will take the test for the grade that they are enrolled in eSchool. So even if a student is in 8th grade and was in 8th grade last year, that student will again take the 8th grade test. A few more policy updates. Language learners are not exempt from the required tests for grades 1 and 2. That is the Iowa. Only IEP teams and 504 teams may make that decision for students in grades 1 and 2. For the ACT Aspire classroom assessments only, again, this is just the classroom assessments. Text-to-speech is not available, so a test administrator may read the math or science portion from the computer screen if that student has read aloud in his or her IEP or 504 plan. So let's talk about some things that are specific to the ACT Aspire. These are the times, the standard times for test sessions for this coming year. Some of the test sessions time has been lengthened, so I think that you'll find that beneficial for your students. And now let's talk about some accessibility features and accommodations. You may find in-depth description of the accessibility features and accommodations in the ACT Aspire Accessibility Manual. It's called an Accessibility User's Guide. You'll notice that on this screenshot, Arkansas, Spring 2016 is circled. Be sure that when you pull down the Accessibility User's Guide from the ACT Aspire Avocet site, that you are getting the Arkansas-specific manual. There is information in that particular manual that is different from the general ACT Aspire Accessibility User's Guide. I do believe that this manual is currently being updated. There shouldn't be major changes in it, but there may be a few things that will change. So we'll need to pay close attention to see if there's an Arkansas, either winter or spring it will probably be spring 2017 accessibility manual. All right, default embedded system tools. These are things that are available to all users when they start a test. They're either integrated into the computer platform itself or maybe locally provided. Locally provided would be things like scratch paper, things that would be embedded in a regular testing situation. There is no advance request needed for these, and a PNP is not needed. So every student has access to these things: answer eliminator, highlighter, scratch paper. You will want to make sure that your students know how to use these things, where to locate them on the ACT Aspire platform, and how to turn them on and use those effectively. Calculator is available for grades 6 through early high school, which is our 9th and 10th grade test. Notice that it is not available for grades 3, 4, and 5. It is not available even for students who have Calculator as an accommodation in their IEP. So that is not an allowed accommodation. It would invalidate that student's score if he used a Calculator in grades 3 through 5. Mark items for review or bookmark them. Browser zoom, also cut, copy, and paste, tools that we use often, but again, the students will need to know how to operate those and to use those. They will need a little practice. Every student may have these. No P&P is needed. Open access features are available to all users, but they must be identified in advance and placed in the PNP. Notice that it says a PNP is needed. So these are for any student, not just students with LPACs or 504s or IEPs. So the thing to keep in mind here is, if you have students who need open access features, does your district have a plan for how those will be entered onto a PNP? Who will make the decision? That is entirely up to the district, but the district does need to have a plan for choosing these open access features for students who do not have an LPAC, a 504, or an IEP. Notice also that for students with IEPs, these open access features should be included in the statewide testing section of the IEP. For the new pilot IEP form, there is a page that's called the assessment decision page. If you're using the old IEPs, that would be your consideration of special factors page. But again, open access features should be included on the IEP. And here are some of the open access features, and keep in mind, again, any student can have these. Answer masking, this covers one answer at a time, or would cover all of the answers, allowing the student to look at one answer at a time. This might be a good tool for students with ADHD or others who just have a hard time focusing, so students would need to know how to use that and where to locate it. Respond and test booklet are on scratch paper. Dictate responses. Now, there's a very specific protocol for how the dictation works with ACT Aspire. The student does have to spell each word the first time the word is used and include capitalization and punctuation. So as you can probably imagine, this would take a considerable amount of time. However, extra time is an accommodation. So you just need to keep that in mind. Another open access feature, augmentative and alternative communication devices that have local print, a magnifier, color contrast, and a line reader. Again, these are things that all students can have. They do need to be identified in advance so that that PMP can be marked in advance. Again, if your district does not have a plan for how these would be chosen for students who do not have IEPs, 504s, or LPAC plans, that plan needs to be created. Here's some more of the open access features. Breaks supervised within each day. This may be for a student who has medical needs, perhaps taking some type of medication that requires him or her to have frequent restroom breaks. This is nice because that student's assessment can be paused, allowing him or her to go to the restroom and then come back and have the test started again. Special seating or grouping. This is what we have typically called small group setting. And notice that this is open access. Any student has the option of being in a small group. Location for movement. Individual administration. Again, this is open access. Any student who needs it can have this test administered individually. Home administration and other administration. The home administration would be when 2 test administrators would go into the student's home. It would need to be a paper version of the assessment, so this would need to be identified in advance. But it is now possible to give a student who is at home the ACT Aspire as long as 2 test administrators go into the home to give that test. Audio environment, visual environment, this would be things like an FM loop system, other supports that students would need, physical motor equipment. I think of the big exercise balls that some students sit on. That might be something that would be beneficial for a student. Okay, so the next level are accommodations, and these are high-level accessibility tools needed by relatively few students. The ACT Aspire system requires that these be requested by educational personnel on behalf of a student through the PMP process. These also have to be documented on a student's IEP, 504 plan, or LPAC plan. So these are only allowed for students who have one of those types of plans. Accommodations listed on the IEP, 504, or LPAC should be used throughout the year in the instructional setting. A student should never have access to an accommodation for the first time on statewide testing. These should be used throughout the year, and they should be used effectively so that the people working with the student know that the student knows how to use these accommodations and that the student knows how to use them well and that they are effective. I would also suggest that you check the duration of services on the front page of the IEP. Just make sure that you are using that IEP that will be in effect at test time. The accommodations that have been used throughout the year and are listed on the IEP 504 or LPAC should be entered on the PNP. And again, the district will need to have some process for making sure that this happens effectively. All right, this is a section of text from a new manual that was released in the spring from the assessment unit, the ADE guidelines for assessment accessibility, selecting accessibility features and accommodations for students with disabilities and English learners. This whole manual is available on the assessment website. If you cannot find it, feel free to let me know. I can send it to you. I also have it linked to a Google Doc that I will share with you at the end of this presentation. But this is just one little piece from that manual. All accommodations requested for use by students for statewide testing must be documented in the student's current IEP, 504, or LPAC plan, and be an allowable accommodation. So there again, you can't put that calculator on there for a 4th grader. The same accommodations requested for testing must also be used with the student in the classroom. So again, these need to be used throughout the year and effective for that student. Okay, so here are some of the accommodations. The first one, human reader, a ACT Aspire says that human readers should read from paper, so this would have to be a paper-based test. They do not want the human reader reading from the computer screen. Extra time of 300% is strongly recommended for the paper form test, but it's not automatically assigned. So extra time would be manually selected in the PNP. However, the student's IEP or 504 plan must state that that student needs extra time as well. Students are not required to sit for the entire extended time period. This is only available for students with a physical disability. We are an online testing state, so all students are expected to take the test online. However, if a student has a physical disability that would prevent him or her from using the online platform, that's understandable. It might be a student who has seizures, who does not need to look at the flickering computer screen. But for a student, say, with a reading disability, that student would have that reading disability whether the test is on paper or computer. So that child would need to take the test on the computer. Notice text-to-speech, English only. We are an English-only testing state, so if a student has text-to-speech, it will be in English. The IEP may state read aloud, which would be text-to-speech for ACT Aspire, or could be a human reader for district-wide assessments. Extra time, there are different amounts of extra time that can be entered onto the ACT Aspire PNP. The district will decide whether the IEP lists the percentage of extra time or if the IEP just will say extra time, and the percentage could be determined then when it's time to put information on those PNPs. Again, that is a district decision whether the percentage of time is listed on the IEP or if it just says extra time. If a district is shopping for electronic spellers for students to use on the writing portion of the test, the best thing to do is to buy the least expensive one you can find. It needs to be one that does not have internet access, so just as few features as possible on those electronic spellers. And there is information about the guidelines for selection of electronic spellers in the accessibility guide. Okay, so we've had lots of questions about text-to-speech with the periodic test and with the summative. So on the classroom test, there is no text-to-speech available. So the test administrator may read the questions aloud from the monitor. As far as the interim assessments, students should use the text-to-speech, and test administrators should not read the questions from the monitor. Notice that on interims, the students will take interim 1 and interim 2, and then interim 3 and 4 will be repeats of interims 1 and 2. On the summative, students should use the text-to-speech, or if a student needs a paper test for a human reader, that would have to be approved using a special accommodation request. Again, only students with a physical disability that keep him or her from using the online test would be given the paper test accommodation. Okay, for students with hearing impairments, we have some different sign language options here. You can see that students may have directions only for all 5 tests: reading, English, writing, math, and science. They may have the test items signed, but only in writing, math, and science. Okay, so for students who have visual impairments, several things here: different types of Braille. Contracted is available, or uncontracted. It can include tactile graphics, can have text-to-speech. So there are many choices here for Braille users. Also, large print is available. And for students who need a calculation counting tool, an abacus is available for math. And that's the little tool that has beads that students can use to count. So human readers and human signers. Students using the human reader accommodation must have that paper-based test. So again, the schools must receive approval prior to ordering that test, and they are only available as an accommodation for a student with a physical disability that prevents access to the online test. ACT Aspire recommends that human readers and signers be in a one-to-one setting. However, in Arkansas, we understand that may cause some difficulty. So those human readers and human signers may have up to 5 students per group. They must be in the same grade, however. Also, one other thing to keep in mind about the paper-based test, there are some formats that require paper, such as Braille, or the sign language formats. If a paper test is required for that type of test, you do not have to have a special accommodation request approved for that. Okay, this is a screenshot for choosing text-to-speech, and you can notice here that text-to-speech may be chosen for writing, science, math. Students may have text-to-speech in 1, 2, or all 3 of those types of tests. This is what it looks like on the online PMP. Notice also that text-to-speech audio is also available with orienting description that would explain graphs and different types of visuals that would be on the screen. Extra time. Boy, we've had lots of questions about this. If a student is receiving text-to-speech for an area, let's say science, 300% time will automatically be added by the ACT Aspire computer platform, but you won't be able to see it here. Notice that the people who enter this kind of information usually can choose 150%, 200, 250, 300, or 400% of the standard time. However, what you need to understand is that if a student has text-to-speech marked on the previous screen here, if text-to-speech is marked, then 300% is already going to be added to that part of the test. So for English and reading, text-to-speech is not available, so you would need to add the extra time there. If a student has text-to-speech on his or her IEP but not extra time, that student's test must be stopped at the end of the standard time. The countdown clock is going to show the 300% time. So the student and the parent need to be aware prior to that testing that the countdown clock will not be correct, and that test administrator will stop the student's test before the countdown clock reaches the end. That test administrator will stop the test at the end of the standard time. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that ACT Aspire's research has shown that students who require text-to-speech typically also need that 300% extra time because we listen to text at a slower rate than we can read silently. So because this gets so confusing, the assessment unit made this great little chart that has helped me quite a bit in keeping up with this. And so I wanted to go over this with you. So for the students who have just extra time on their IEP, you'll notice that the amount of extra time will need to be added, the percentage. Those are the rows in blue. So you're just adding the percentage of extra time needed. In the green, notice that reading and English do not have text-to-speech available. So the extra time will need to be added. Now, these are for students who have text-to-speech and extra time on their IEPs. So again, text-to-speech is not available for reading and English. So the person putting this into the online PMP will need to add the amount of extra time that is needed. Writing, math, and science do have text-to-speech available, and anytime text-to-speech is marked in the online PMP, ACT Aspire is going to automatically give them 300% extra time. So let's say, for instance, a student has extra time and text-to-speech for science. Text-to-speech is marked in the PMP, 300% extra time is automatically given. If that district person also marks 300%, that student is actually going to be getting 300% of 300% extra time. So that is a huge amount of time for that student, and is not, I fear, what should be happening here. So just understand, if text-to-speech has been marked, that student's going to get 300% on those sections that have text-to-speech available. Now, where it becomes a little sticky is this row at the bottom, where students have text-to-speech in an IEP, but do not have extra time. So on reading and English, it doesn't matter, because text-to-speech isn't available anyway. So those students will have reading and English, the countdown clock will be great, everything will work just fine. But on the writing, math, and science portions, text-to-speech has been marked, and ACT Aspire automatically assigns 300% for those students. However, because those students do not have extra time marked in their IEPs, they're going to have to stop and submit their test at the end of the regular time. And I mentioned this on the previous slide. The problem with that is that the countdown clock is still going to have that 300% showing. So that student is going to have to know that he or she is going to stop at the end of the regular time, and the countdown clock will not be accurate. You would also, I think, want the parent to know that that's going to be the case, because you don't want that student going home and saying that the teacher stopped him before it was time to submit the test. I know this is confusing. I hope this chart does help somewhat. It helped me. I was very thankful that the assessment unit created this. But if you do have questions, please let me know. One thing I do want to go over again, though, is that the ACT Aspire research shows that students who need text-to-speech typically need that extra time as well. So you may want to look at your students' IEPs and 504s and determine if those accommodations are correctly listed. If the student has text-to-speech or read aloud, does that student actually need extra time? And of course, you could check this in the classroom with classroom assessments and different kind of work that the student does in the classroom to see if that student actually does need that extra time as well. Okay, so modifications are not permitted on ACT Aspire, and the reason I put this in here is because in Arkansas we have in the past had some confusion with the term accommodation and modification. In fact, our old IEP had classroom modifications at the top. So we need to understand what an accommodation is versus a modification and use these terms correctly. Otherwise, we'll get a little confused with what's happening in a classroom and what's permitted on statewide testing. So an accommodation does not lower learning expectations, whereas a modification does lower learning expectations. So here's a few little examples here. So for accommodation, the use of a calculator to compute the volume of a prism. Well, if the learning expectation is to compute the volume of a prism, the calculator is just a support tool to allow that student to show what he or she knows about computing the volume of a prism. However, if the student has simplified problems, maybe one-step problems where the learning expectation is to solve two-step problems, that's a modification because you're lowering that learning expectation. In literacy or many other subjects, a student may use a word processor, a computer, a Chromebook, instead of handwriting an assignment. That's much more common now than it was a few years ago. This is kind of using the computer is much more accepted, but I remember in days past when students were expected to handwrite assignments, and some teachers were hesitant to let students type those. A modification would be a shortened assignment on a simplified topic. There again, you're learning that learning expectation, lowering the learning expectation. An accommodation may be an extended time to complete an assignment, whereas a modification would be reducing the answer choices from 4 choices to just 2 choices. You're lowering that learning expectation. So let's just be sure that we're using our terms correctly. Accommodations keep the learning expectations the same. modifications alter or lower those learning expectations. We are creating a short little presentation that we will be linking to our website, going more in depth into the difference in accommodation and modification. All right, so let's switch to the Iowa for just a moment. Questions are read aloud to all students except in vocabulary, reading, and one part of the computation test. So IEP and 504 plans should not state that a student will have any of those 3 sections read to them, because only allowable accommodations should be placed on the IEP. We should, again, never put that a student in 3rd grade would use a calculator on ACT Aspire, because that is not an allowable accommodation. Also, IEP teams may not state in a student's IEP that he or she will not test. We've seen that quite a bit on special factors pages, where the IEP team has put on that document that the student will not take the statewide assessment. Please do not do that. We have guidance from Arkansas as well as from the federal level stating that this is not something that IEP teams should ever put on an IEP. However, if a student is medically fragile, the district testing coordinator will enter that documentation from the student's medical professional into the assessment correction engine, the ACE engine, after testing. But again, it should never state in an IEP that the student will not test. Okay, just a few things here that I want to make sure you are aware of. If you would, make sure that there is a plan in place just to make sure that a student will not take both ACT Aspire and MSAA. We did have a few students in the state last year who took both, and so we want to make sure that your district has a plan in place to make sure that does not happen this year. Has your district made sure that students have the correct course codes and codes in the alternate assessment field? There was an email that was sent out on the TACHAC listserv. That's the listserv that counselors and district testing coordinators and other folks use. It was sent out recently explaining a report that districts could run to see if there are any mismatches in course codes and codes in the alternate assessment field. And if you don't know how to run that report, let me know and I'll forward that email to you. Okay, are IEP teams knowledgeable on the criteria for participation in the Arkansas alternate assessments? With ESSA, ESSA, states will have a 1% limit of students who can take the alternate assessments. And the state will not put that 1% cap on districts, but schools who have been giving the alternate to more than 1% of their students may be asked to justify those assessment decisions. The participation guidelines and checklist document list types of evidence that districts can use to show that IEP team decisions are correct, and that is linked for you here. Again, the state cannot come in and say you can only test 1% on alternate, but if you are over that alternate, there will likely be people asking you to justify those decisions. So if you have a special population that you just are over 1% and those are accurate decisions, that will be fine as long as you have this checklist document and can show that those decisions are correct. There were some districts in our state last year who didn't assess every student. So just make sure that your district has a plan to make sure that every student in your district will be assessed with a statewide assessment, either the regular or the alternate. All right, so here's my contact information, and that tiny URL at the bottom is a Google Doc where I link many of the documents that I use routinely. You may be able to find something there that's useful to you. There's quite a bit of assessment information. There's also dyslexia information, course codes, just quite a few different things. So I hope that you will find that useful. Also, you'll see my phone number there and my email address. So please let me know if you have any questions, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much.